All right. Good morning. Okay, so in our last session, we started talking about narrative and the theories of narrative and the importance of narrative as a strategy for, or as a way of dealing with literary texts, from the point of view of narrative. And we said that narrative is basic to everything we do. It's basic to human existence, if you want to say. Okay? Because anything or everything comes through narrative, through language and through narrative. All right? And I gave examples of different forms that narrative can take, and also some definitions of the narrative, like the one that you see in the slide in here. But it's a simplest way of defining a narrative would be to define it as a series of events in a specific order. And notice that there is specific order. It doesn't say chronological order, because if you say chronological order, that's one type of narrative, not every type. But a specific order could be anything. It could be any order you choose. Or the writer chooses, or anyone who speaks actually, or tells a story or an account chooses. So the order changes from different persons, from one person to another, from one author to another, from different ways of thinking about narrative. But most narratives in this sense have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or an ending. You have that basic constant in narratives. You start a story and then you go and you progress towards an end. Right? That's very important. This structure is important, and we will see how this linear, right? We call it linear because it's events that have a beginning, then develop into something and then end somewhere. It's linear, right? Linear in the sense that it's like following a line. Usually we call it a timeline, whether it's broken or not, whether it's chronological or not. Still, it's a timeline that we can figure out. We can try to work out in different ways, but it's there, right? Okay, I'll show you more details about this. I gave the example of Joyce's short story, The Dead, from Dubliners. That story, if you want to summarize it like very simply, you would say that it starts with the arrival of Gabriel and his wife Greta at a party. And the story tells then of the events of the party, and the couples walk home, and it ends as they fall asleep in their hotel room. That's what happens, if you want. These are the events, because there is a beginning. An event is something that we can see as some sort of an action, right? That we can identify as an action, as something that happens in the real world. Even though this is a fictitious world, of course, but it's like familiar to us in the real world. Somebody going to some place, then doing this, and then doing that. And then somewhere, okay? But in between, what happens is quite different, right? Within the 20 pages or the 15 pages of the story, you have so many things happening, but most of them are not events in the normal sense or the usual sense of the word, because these are things that happen in the mind, right? Things that happen in the mind in the sense of the thoughts, right? Consciousness, things what they think about, their perceptions of things, how they see things, etc. And that's what you read in the story. You don't read the events like it's an action. If you take an action film, an action movie, you're interested in the action. You're not interested in what the character thinks. I mean, the person who makes the movie basically concentrates on the action, because that's why it's called an action movie, because there is so much action. So many things happening, like lots of fights and races and this and that and bombings and whatever, because it concentrates on the action in the film. Whereas in this narrative, for example, and many others, you have everything but what you can identify as physical action. Okay? We have also something similar in books, like I told you examples of novels. For example, the same author, James Joyce himself, who wrote this book called Ulysses, that goes over 700 pages, but it only spans one day in the life of 3 characters, right? And so if you go straight 700 pages, what happens in your life in a day will fill probably 1 page or 2. But then she likes that song, I think, and she wants to share it with us. Can you lower down the sound? She's looking at me as a friend. Yes. Right? Thanks. Okay. Okay, they're nice students. So I think she forgot that there is a class. So anyway, so physical events in narratives are, basically very small. Except if when you study, when you read a story, for example, you read an epic poem or an epic story about adventures, right? Then you have action as well in a narrative, right? A film is also, by the way, a narrative, because you say it's still a narrative because it's a story being told, and and there is a specific order, and that order can be time order, can be cause and effect, can be so many things. So links between events are what makes the narrative what it is. Okay? All right. Yes, okay. So narratives, I already spoke about this last time, how narratives are not always chronological. I just said that, because you can have flashbacks, you can have like anticipations, things going forward, like the story jumps to the future, comes back into the past, and etc. So it's like, yes, it's completely disordered. Chronologically, it's called disorder because it doesn't follow the logical, the familiar way we think of things, the everyday life understanding of stories as things that are happening from A to B to C to D, etc., like in this order. But that one, the stories, and authors do this on purpose sometimes because they have to be faithful to their own thinking, to their own way of seeing things, and also to sometimes philosophical ideas about what time means. Is time what we see on a watch, or is time something that's actually in our heads? Are they equivalent? The way we think about time, is it the same? Or the way we live time? Because we live in time, but do we live in time the same way as we see it on a watch? If you're in a desert or in a place that's remote and you have no watch, would you even know what time it is? Exactly, you wouldn't know. You would basically just see that's the beginning of the day, middle of the day, end of the day, but you will not be really following that order, right? And you will not be rushed by any kind of something that will tell you, you have to be here at 10, you have to be here at 12, etc. So time is really just a matter of managing our lives, right? How we manage our relationships, the economy, our work, etc. But outside of that, time becomes just a continuum that you live through in the present moment, but you never really think about the details of time, whether it's 5 minutes past or 10 minutes before, etc. So that just goes like that. Anyway, so there are other forms, and those writers try to sometimes think about this and write about the way people live time, or not even think about time. And that's what they call the stream of consciousness, because it's the way ideas connect in the minds, in the consciousness of a character, of us, because they're trying to be like us, right? It always says something about how we think. It makes you think about the way you think. When you're sitting home, when you're lying, you're trying to sleep, and you can't find sleep, right? What goes on in your mind? It's not like your mind is completely empty. There are things happening in your mind. You remember things, you think about things, and you don't even think sometimes, but things are there happening, etc. And so that stream, it's like the stream of consciousness that they try to copy, right? To copy in the sense of writing it down as narrative, right? And so it has its own logic, the connections between events, the connection between thoughts and memories, etc. There is a famous beginning of a novel I told you about in the beginning of the course. Marcel Proust wrote this huge book. It's called À la recherche du temps perdu, right? In search of lost time, where the whole thing starts with the smell of a madeleine. You know madeleine? It's a cake. You know the madeleine, the things that you buy, the cheap kind of cake. But he smelled it, and he's an adult. He's not like a boy when he smelled it. But he remembered what it smelled like when he was 10 or 12, when he was a boy. And that like triggered an incredible flow of memories. And that's what he was writing. Since then, that he started to remember everything just because of the smell of something that reminded him of something that happened in his life. And from there, one thing connects with another. And then he has like 12 or 13 volumes in one novel called À la recherche du temps perdu, because it's 12 books, right? It's not one. And then there is the last one, which is the time found, le temps retrouvé, time found, the last one. Okay, so, all right, I already gave you examples of Foster recognizes an aspect of the novel. The chronological order of events is not the whole story. He makes a distinction between the kind, I gave you the example, the king died and then the queen died, etc. On the one hand, and the king died and then the queen died of grief, etc. Whereas he is inserting a cause and effect, a different relationship between two events. In the first example, you have two events related by time, right? He says, the king died and then the queen died. We only have a time relationship because there is one succession. One comes after the other. Whereas in the second one, it's completely different. You have both the time, but also another cause that is not there, which is grief. Right? Sorry? Yes, cause and effect. Right? So we have time on one side, and we have also this other causality, we call it. Okay? So, logical or causal, right? It's about logic, right? We think of it as logical. One thing connects with another, and so it's logical. Or causal, because one is the cause of another thing. One becomes the effect of something that precedes it. One event precedes another, and so becomes its cause. Between one event and another constitute fundamental aspects of every narrative. An obvious example would be detective stories, of course, right? You have detective stories in which what the detective tries to do is connects the dots. You know, he has clues and he has to go and find one by one and try to connect them until he finds the criminal, right? To solve the case. He says, I'm going to solve the case by finding who did it. And this is the type of fiction that goes with it. It's called the whodunit. Who done it? And it's even written in a special way. I don't know if it's in that. No, I don't think it is there. We call it whodunit in this sense. In this whodunit. Right? It's a strange spelling, but it's in other words, who did it, or who had done it, who had done the crime, who did the crime, right? Who done it? It's a genre in detective stories, because you're looking for who did who committed the crime. Okay. Right. Okay. So the beginning, middle, end, the beginning, middle, end, the sequence. That sequence. It also tends to emphasize what is known as teleological progression. In other words, a progression towards the end. The telos, from the Greek words, is end, right? Telos. That's what telos, teleological from. We call teleology. Teleology is a philosophy. It's actually a branch in philosophy where we justify things or explain them by their ends, by their purposes and their ends, what they achieve, etc. It's called teleology. It's a process in thinking, right? Okay? It's also the place to get to, where you want to go, because it's the story, when you start reading a novel, you want to get to the end. You want to get to the end because you believe that the story from beginning promises something, that it will deliver at the end. It gives you a promise. When you open a book, when you see the title of a book, the book promises something. It promises a mysterious story, a fascinating story, an exciting story, maybe sometimes just a boring story. But it promises something, and that something is what you try to get to at the end by finishing the book. sometimes, when you get tired of too much detail, just skip some pages. Say, no, I want to get faster so I can get to something that's more exciting. Otherwise, I would just lose interest and throw away the book. Right? Sometimes this happens all the time to readers. Okay, but that's not the case when you're studying for an exam. You shouldn't do that if you're doing it for an exam, for a class, basically. Right? In poetry or in poetry in general, we don't have that. It's not the end that counts, right? But what counts is having a big picture of the full poem, and even sometimes having different images from the same poem. Like if I gave you the example of the wasteland. The wasteland, when you look at it, you can read each section on its own, and each one is a poem. And even sometimes each couple of lines or so gives an image. And what you want to do is you want to collect and connect all those images that the poem offers. Right? It's a lot of work, but you need to connect all those images so you get to a final view of what the wasteland is. Because the wasteland promises you to talk about a wasteland. And the question that you're asking, how is it a wasteland? What makes it a wasteland? Why does he call it a wasteland in the first place? A wasteland is a place that's dead. It's a land that's completely dead. When there is absolutely no vegetation, or nothing interesting. It's just like ashes and etc. It's a dead land, basically. But you want to know why and in what sense, etc. And so, in order to do that, you have to follow all those images that the poet offers. Right? The poem gives you images as he goes from one line to another, or from a couple lines, or from section to section. You have different visions, and then at the end, you get that final picture, right? But it doesn't mean that at the end you will have the from beginning, or you can also have images from beginning already of what makes it a wasteland, right? The poem, the part we saw here that I explained to you, already gives you that, and but you have more, right? So the more you read, the more you find, right? But it doesn't mean that at the end he will summarize it or give you a summary, or give you a reason, or etc. It doesn't happen that way. Okay, but we read poetry as we read narratives sometimes, right? We just read line by line until the end, and then try to understand the whole thing. Right? But detective novels give you an answer. At the end, you say, this is who committed the crime and how they committed the crime. Which is the same thing if you watch detective series, for example, like TV shows where detectives are also looking for the criminal. Okay. Right. Okay. So the common understanding of a good story is the one that you say, when I start it, I do not want to put it down. I want to finish it. This is a common thing about all humans. You say, well, it's so beautiful, I cannot put it down. You start the book and you don't want to put it down until you finish it. Just like a film or anything else. You start it, you want to finish because it's so exciting, so entertaining, and it's captivating, and you want to continue, right? Because there are techniques for this. One of them is suspense, for example, or so many things happening, and you want to continue. The narrative theorist Peter Brooks studied ways in which readers' desires are directed towards the end. Right? We have desires, and our desire is to find out what happens. Right? So we are continually looking for what happens, and that's what the narrative plays on. It uses that. The writer uses that. The writer knows that we are interested in what happens. And so they start to give you what happens, like little by little. They don't give you the full thing, the whole thing at once. Otherwise, the story will end there. But they give you little by little. Sometimes they give you the ending at the end, at the beginning. So, like most movies, for example, it starts with a criminal. It starts with the crime being committed, not the progression towards the crime. but actually the crime happened, and then the detective goes back in time to find out how it happened, etc. In narratives, that's a form of narrative too, because then when they give you the crime, you are interested also, they say, well, the reader or the viewer is interested in knowing how it happened and when and who are these people. And so we will be continually, reading or following so that you can get to that point. And so it is something in us because we are used to stories from the day you were born until you die. We are surrounded by stories of all kinds, stories of politics, of events, of economy, technology, of everything. Stories are around us all the time. We live with stories. We tell stories. We are told also as stories. When your friends talk about you, they talk to you about as a story, right? You become a character in a fiction too. Or if somebody lies about you, so for example, you have someone who doesn't like you and who wants to ruin your relationship with another person, they will go and tell them a completely different story of who you are. And then you become, for that person who listens to the story, you're a character in a fiction story, right? It's a lie because it's a fiction, right? It's not real because it's not who you are. But doesn't mean that novels are lies. Because the novelist who writes a story about someone is not interested in lying to you about someone. Except when they're talking about, for example, historical figures. A historical figure, you take any historical figure, a person that is known in history, and you want to write their biography. Not biography, let's just say write their story. Biography is a complicated thing. But a story about them, or their story. You can tell their story, and you can invent stories for them. Right? Because that person is not here, that person is absent, and whoever told the stories about them, they did not say everything. So there is always something left. There is always something that we don't know. And as a narrator, as a storyteller or as a writer, you are interested in complementing, in finishing off the story, in giving it a different perspective, in writing it in a different way. Right? Sometimes it happens also in stories themselves. Right? Novels that have been written, for example, like Robinson, I gave you the example of Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is a novel written by Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe is an 18th century English writer. He's a famous English novelist. And he wrote this story of a man who was shipwrecked. In other words, he was like lost at sea. His ship broke in an island, in a desert island, and he lived there for 2 years or something on his own. But he found someone. There is a person, a black guy. He found him on the island and immediately turned him into a servant, a slave. Which is very interesting because he found a black guy. He's white. I mean, Robinson Crusoe is a white guy. He's an Englishman. And he survived on this island. When he was there, he found this man. His name is Friday. He called him Friday, by the way. And he turned him into his slave. Made him work for him, did things for him, helped him with everything, etc., etc. And so we have that story from Daniel Defoe, right? But then someone else, 200 years later, or something, or so, a South African writer named Coetzee, J.M. Coetzee. He wrote the story of Robinson Crusoe. But instead of telling the story of Robinson Crusoe, he told the story of who, do you think? Yeah. Because nobody said the story. Nobody knows the story of Friday, how he came to be there and how he came to be a slave, etc. And so his story is untold. And then somebody told that story. They're both fiction. Since the first one is fiction, Robinson Crusoe is fiction, then also the other one, well, I'll say why, it's a fiction anyway, so let's just say, let's write the story of this oppressed person, this person who was like by chance, like there, and then somebody turned him into a slave. What gives him the right to turn him into a slave, for example? And so the novel is called Foe. Foe, just foe. And foe is enemy in English, right? You know the word foe. foes, we say friends and foes, for example. It's a foe, is an enemy. The title of the book is called Foe, by the way. I'm sorry? Yes, yeah. It's not just about Friday, but a lot of other things. In other words, what? That's the, yeah, this is there is a French book also written in the same way, but it's from the perspective of Vendredi. Yeah. This one, I haven't read that one. I know it, but I haven't read it. But I know this one because I read it. Vendredi ou la vie sauvage, yes. It's like they have it in school, right? Yeah, I saw that at school, like in college or something. They have that in Morocco, in programs. By, remember the writer? Michel Tournier, I think. Yeah, a French writer. But anyway, so he wrote it from a completely different. In other words, what was missing, right, from the story of Robinson Crusoe was provided by another writer. And what was missing is the story of Friday, because Friday doesn't speak. We know nothing about him. We all know that he's a slave, and we only know what Robinson Crusoe tells us about him, right? But he never gets to speak. He's what we call a colonial subject, because he's colonized in his own land by someone who was a foreigner who came there and started colonizing. The whole thing is like, even with Daniel Defoe, the story is a sort of an allegory of colonialism. That's what except that the guy was shipwrecked. It's by chance that he ended there, Robinson Crusoe. But the British went on purpose to these different islands and different, continents and countries and colonized them and found the people there and enslaved them. They turned them into servants and slaves and sold them on the markets of Europe and America, etc. So the narrative, there is a narrative and a counter-narrative, or counter-narratives coming from one narrative. Right? This is what we call counter-narrative. And even that same story itself is based on a different story. Anyway, it's a complicated story, it's based on other stories, etc. And so the narratives generate other narratives. Okay? So, for example, if you read a novel based on this, based on the fact that we want to know more, on that we are reading to find out more about what happens in a story, sometimes the narrators start to play tricks on us, right? For example, I give you an example of the book, an 18th century book by Lawrence Sterne. I don't know if you remember this. Lawrence Sterne, the book is called The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman. It's a long title. The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. It's a 19th. It's a mock story, if you want. And it was written at the time that people writing novels, but he was writing a novel in a completely different way, because that novel goes nowhere. It goes in circles, right? And then you have blank pages, for example. You go, and then when the narrator just gets tired of talking, he says, you know what, I can't tell you everything, but I will just make a drawing. Remember, my story is just a line like this, and then there is a page with just one line that's completely crazy on the page. And it's not following any logical order or any familiar organization of events, but it's broken up. Right? And he was very experimental. When he was writing stories against the way people read and write stories in the traditional way. It's unconventional. Okay? And you have so many like those. For example, you have in films, in the cinema, you have the experience of Alfred Hitchcock. How many of you know or heard about Alfred Hitchcock? Okay. Alfred Hitchcock? Yeah. Alfred Hitchcock is a filmmaker, right? And he made great films. His films are just amazing. People study his films. In schools, they studied the films of Hitchcock because it was based on suspense. Hitchcock is a filmmaker, but he would stop the film. You're watching the film, and suddenly the film stops, and it's Hitchcock that appears. And he doesn't just do it like that. He does it at a moment where you're expecting something, like, a moment of high tension. When you are expecting something to happen, or something is going to happen, he'll say, stop. And he comes up. And then starts talking about his character, or talking about the film. And people get nervous and oh, just get out of the scene. I want to watch the film. But he was doing that on purpose, of course, to break that thing, so you don't get involved too much, so that, it's like questioning this habit of always wanting to know what's next, because he could be lying to you if he wants. But he breaks it. He breaks that by digression. It's called digression, right? To digress. The same thing that Lawrence Stern does in the novel The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, he also digresses. He starts something, then he starts talking about something completely different. He starts something, and when you become interested and you want to follow what he's saying, then he turns and says, and he starts another story, completely different. And then you say, what is he doing? Why is he doing this? People get unnerved, and people say, this is too much, this is annoying, I want to follow the story, not another story. Let me finish this one first. But it doesn't work. So he breaks that, and lots of fiction does that all the time. Most modernist fiction is built on this idea of breaking this habit of always wanting more, etc. Because it has to do with psychology, it has to do with the whole philosophy of what should we cultivate that kind of habit, which is basically childish, because it's impulsive. You are only interested in immediate pleasure because you want to finish the story. You are interested in the gratification. Gratification is pleasure, right? And you want it now. And so you say, wait. Hold on a moment. Then they say, what? And people are not happy most of the time. And people don't like that kind of books. Most people don't. But they are interested because they say, if you only follow that, what kind of people are we preparing? What kind of generations are we doing? Are we preparing for the future? Are the people going to be only interested in instant gratification? Right? Is that what we want? Instant gratification? Because it doesn't end. Right? It's like drugs. Dopamine. Because that's what happens. You have this, it creates, your mind starts to create this hormone, dopamine, that gives you pleasure. And if you don't have it, if it stops creating that, the more you have it, your brain gets used to that, then at a certain moment, it becomes an addiction. That's what happens with drug addicts. Right? It's so good, it's high and floating. And it's that great pleasure that they have there. But when it ends, they go immediately and have more. And the more you have, the more addicted they become. And so they're completely destroyed because they can't live without it. And it's the same in literature, in films, in all kinds of things, games, for example, in video games. It's the same. They're all based on this, on this instant gratification. But literature makes you stop and say, wait, we have to think. Why do you have to follow only that gratification? Because you want the ending. You want that where there is pleasure, right? You want to achieve that, instant of gratification. You understand? So that's the thing about, breaking those habits. It's to elevate and educate people, to teach them something different than just following pleasure like a beast. Or I don't know even what the beast is that. But anyway, so that's the point behind all this. Okay, this is Peter Brooks says, studies ways in which readers' desires are directed towards the end, ways in which narratives are structured towards or a series of digressions from an ending. Right. So when we have the digression does not mean that there is no ending. Does not mean that there is no gratification. If they break it only to make it longer, but it's like slowing down the process of impulse because it's impulsive. You want When we are impulsive, we want instant gratification. But digression makes us brake, right? Like you push the brakes, like in a car. You don't want to go faster. Wait a minute. Let's take our time. Enjoy it a little bit, bit by bit, not all of it at once. So the digression, when you digress means you get out of the subject. It's like you have a road that you want to take. You understand the meaning of digression? To digress is not to follow a direct line, but it's to go round and round, etc., and then to reach that end where you can go straight. And it sounds good when you say just go straight to the point, right? But go straight to the point in this case is like finishing the story quickly and having that instant gratification. Whereas if you digress, you have a different experience of the ending, which is still there. There's still an ending. Sometimes there is no ending. Or an ending becomes a joke on you, on the reader. Becomes a farce. You anticipate the ending so much that the ending is really not good. And then it's a trick that the narrator played on you, right? Because what he wanted you to know is actually the digression, not the point of the story. Because the point of the story is pointless. But those digressions are the point. Those are the things. So the process becomes the end, right? The journey towards the end is what important, not the end in itself. Okay? So that's how narrative also works in this. We are able to read present moments in literature and by extension in life as endowed with narrative meaning only because we read them in anticipation of the structuring power of those endings that will retrospectively give them the order and significance of plot. This is what Brooks says in 1984. Okay? Because when we read them, we say, when we reach the end, then everything will make sense. We'll reconstruct the order in our heads. We start to understand the full thing. That's the idea, even in such narratives that are disstructured, if you want, or disordered in that way. An example I always give you is the book that we studied in extensive reading and we continue to study this semester. It's called Out of This World, in which you don't know how to order those events. You have to read everything. You have to read all the different chapters, and each chapter there is one of the characters speaking, and it's a technique that has been used before. The famous author who used it is called William Faulkner. I don't know if you know about William Faulkner. He has a famous book called The Sound and the Fury, where you have all the characters speaking, each after the other, telling basically the same thing but from different perspectives and adding a few things more. And so the more you read the story, then you start accumulating the details so that by the end, and the end is not really the end of the story, the end is just the end of the book, you try to reconstruct the story and it becomes really not one story but like 16 stories. Because you have different people saying the same story differently, then each one comes with different, and then it's like diffuse. And this is the question that it's philosophical in the sense that this is what reality is, right? I gave you examples of an event that happens, and if you have 5 people listening or seeing the event, when they tell it, they will tell different stories. And so you have 5 realities instead of one. And so what is the reality in between the two? It's somewhere in the cross sections of these two. You put them together, maybe you will come up with something that's common between them, and you can have a vision. But at least you will have some kind of a complete vision and not just one side or a slanted vision of reality. You will have different angles to see things from. Okay? We do that with history. This is something that we do. History, for example, is written. When you talk about how history is written, it is written always by the powerful, by the winners. We say history is written by the winners, not the losers. The losers don't have any history. The losers are out of history. But who cares about the losers? Well, then the losers have to write their own history. When they write their own history and you compare it with the history of the winners, then you have completely different histories, but at least they are complemented. You put this, well, they complement one another. You have a complete vision. You have a full view, or maybe something close to that of something, right? Do you need an example to understand this? The example of the history of Amazigh in Morocco. The Amazigh. Yeah. The Amazigh people, who told us? I mean, the history of the Amazigh was not told by the Amazigh. It was told by Arab conquerors, the Muslims who came from the east, and they wrote our history for us, and they say, well, you are something. They heard what they say, I mean, they were conquerors. And so if you take the history of the Amazigh, it was completely marginalized, and it was and it's not even in history. When you study history of Morocco, you don't study anything about Amazigh. Until lately, now they study it. Because there are some people who said, wait a minute. I think that that view of history that you're teaching us is not complete. You're forgetting something huge here. You're forgetting 90%, or I don't know, maybe, of the people's history is not in the record. So they have to write the history. And so they write history from a different perspective. The perspective of those who did not make it to the official record. And so we have a completely different history there. Exactly the same thing, like I said, with Foe and Daniel Defoe's history of Robinson Crusoe. We have the history of Robinson Crusoe, but we don't know anything about Foe until someone decided we have to write the history of Friday. That guy who was there and nobody knows anything about. So we have to write that. We have to write because he's also a human being. He was there. He was doing something. How come his story is not told? So we talk about the untold histories, the unsung histories. In other words, not the histories that are celebrated, but those who are completely forgotten or put in the margin or excluded from the record. And so literature allows this, right? It's going into the other side, things that have not been said, things that have been completely absenteed, in other words, put outside of the record, the official record of history. Okay? That's what it is all about. Okay, let's move on. I digress a little bit, but the point is the digression at the end. The ending is not important in this course. It's the progress towards that ending that's important too. So you have to be. Brooks has elaborated on the paradoxical ways in which the dénouement, the end, dénouement is a French word, which is dénouer, comes from dénouer. Nouer and dénouer, you know that. To knot and knot. Nouer is to knot. Like you take a rope and you make a knot, right? And at the end, when you undo it, to unknot. In other words, the story is the story traditionally starts simple and then gets complicated and at the end simplified, right? In other words, explained, or the problem is solved. It's a dénouement, right? And dénouement, in other words, something that was العقدة العقدة تحلت يعني حيدنا العقد. At the end, we explained it. In other words, we undid the knot. So that's why they call it dénouement, which is the ending of the story. Trying up for a story in which, paradoxical ways in which the dénouement or tying up of a story is worked towards through the paradox of digression. And actually, it's not tying up, but it's the untying. When you tie is when you nouer, tie something. You untie is when you open it, right? Because you undo it, right? It's not tying up, it should be untying of a story. It's worked towards through the digression. Okay? Oh, that or is not good. Of digression. Anyway, the paradox of digression. Thus, for example, while we may find a novel, film, or play frustrating if it contains too many digressions from the main plot, we enjoy the suspense involved in delaying the denouement. Suspense movies, thrillers, and so on, in particular, exploit the strangely masochistic pleasure that we take in delay. You know, that's the thing. I mean, this is a different take on it. What I explained earlier about digression and how what we are taught or what we learn is to enjoy the delaying, to enjoy the digression as a form of delaying the final ending, right? Okay, so in that sense, he calls it, Peter Brooks calls it masochistic. You understand the word masochistic? Right? Finding pleasure in pain. In other words, something that is not that's completely unpleasant and disagreeable and sometimes even painful becomes pleasurable for some people. It's like a psychological problem. But yeah, you may not agree with that, right? Exploit the strangely masochistic pleasure that we take in delay. In other words, why should we wait? Let's have it now, right? You understand? When he says the idea is that people are expected to have the thing now. I say, well, you want this, you have to do this and this and this and this. Right? You feel like when you were little and your parents want you to do something, they give you something to say, I will give you a reward, I will give you, I don't know, money or candy or cake or whatever you like, but first you have to do this and this and this and that. But the kid, the child, is only interested in that thing. So you say, no, I want it now. You say, no, but you have to do this first. Right? And the idea is that you're teaching the child to learn, to love and to like at least, the waiting, the doing something with anticipation that there is a reward at the end, not just having the thing right now, that on the spot. Okay? So it's basically similar, what I'm saying. Okay. But what is this end which we so much desire? Brooks and others have suggested that narratives move from a state of equilibrium, a stasis, through a disturbance of this stability and back to a state of equilibrium at the end. In other words, there is nothing happening, things are normal, and then something disrupts that stasis or that phase of nothing happening, just normal thing, and then moving towards restoring the order. Like there was order, then something broke the order, and then we have to restore order again. So order, disorder, order. It's in that like a cycle. When there is order always prevails. This is the basic thing in detective stories, because the detective restores order. A crime, for example, in detective stories and in life in general, is a disturbance, is a disruption of order, of things that are normal, things that we live and that we think of as normal, nothing happening, it's just fine. And then until something bad happens, a crime, for example, and then the job of the police is to find who did it so that they can restore order by punishing, for example, the criminal and compensating or whatever those who were harmed by this, or at least explain what happens. And so because the desire is to go back to order, right? So there is order, disruption of order, and order again. And that order is what we want. We start with it. When it's disrupted, we want to find it again. We want to return to it. I gave an example of this again earlier when I talked about entropy and the law of physics, of the law of nature, that when you don't clean your room for a few days, you come back to it and it's filled with dust, right? And you look at it and you don't like it. You say, no, it's too dirty. I have to clean it. And then you clean it, right? Because you like to go back to where it was clean before. So it's like a natural thing in us, in humans. We always try to restore order. And those are, like psychological things or instincts that we live with and that narrative exploits. Stories exploit this, writers exploit this in order to make their stories. The end of a narrative, the state of equilibrium, occurs when the criminal is discovered, when the lovers get married, or when the tragic hero dies. In addition, this end is characteristically the place of revelation and understanding. This is at the end where you understand, when everything becomes clear. Part of the equilibrium that endings apparently offer is the satisfaction of epistemophilia. We call it epistemophilia, from the word episteme, the reader's desire to know, the desire to know more, or to know, from the Greek word episteme. Episteme is knowledge. Epistemology is the science of knowledge. Philosophy of knowledge is called epistemology. And so we call it epistemophilia. Philia is love, episteme is knowledge, so the love of knowledge, which is basically philosophy. It's like philosophy is the love of wisdom. Huh? Right? The reader's desire to know, from the Greek word episteme. And because of the conventional emphasis on hermeneutic discovery at the end, what we call hermeneutic, this is another word that comes from Greek as well, it's philosophy. Hermeneutic means interpretation, the finding of meaning, or the way we find meaning, right? At the end. And because of the conventional emphasis, conventional, it's general, familiar, something that's common among all people. The convention of putting emphasis on the final meaning of something. We all look for the final meaning. And that's also something that is natural in us as humans. We always want to have the final meaning, because it gives us closure, right? We finish something, we understand everything. Okay, that's fair. Okay, it's like dealing with something. When you're done with it, you have like some sort of closure. You say, oh, well, now we understand it. Let's close that thing and start something else. Right? That's the focus on what we call the hermeneutic discovery at the end. Endings tend to be particularly overdetermined places. We look to the end to provide answers to questions that the text has raised. Right? So at the end, because we have questions since the beginning in our minds, and at the end, we are looking forward to the end so that we can have those answers, right? Answers to those questions. Basically what I was saying earlier in different ways. Okay? So, in modernist narratives are 20th century, or like at least modernism is a literary movement that basically spans the first half of the 20th century. Most examples I gave you from modernism. For example, Joyce, Eliot, those are all modernists. We call them modernists. And so modernist narratives, such as Virginia Woolf is a modernist writer. She's English, those of you who know it, and 20th century novelist who wrote famous novels like, for example, Mrs. Dalloway, I don't know if you heard about that, or To the Lighthouse, A Room of One's Own, so many books that she wrote, Orlando, etc. There are many. And she also wrote short stories. And one of the short stories is called The Mark on the Wall. Right? And The Mark on the Wall, however, in these answers tend to be withheld or else treated ironically. In other words, you read until the end, but you have no answer to your questions. I told you earlier that can be sometimes disappointing, because if you're looking for answers, you will not find them. Right? And it's done on purpose, because they want to break that cycle, like I said. Break the habit of always having some sort of gratification at the end, of having that pleasure of finding everything, of knowing everything at the end. And so they want to break it. It says it's not normal, it's not natural. We should live without having that thing. We should focus on the process, not on the end. Okay? So that's the idea. The idea is that the writers want you to quit the habit of expecting an answer to every question you have. There may not be answers. And sometimes they give you an answer that doesn't cover everything. Right? Okay. The ending of Virginia Woolf's story is paradoxical in that it resolves the question with which the story starts out, what is the mark on the wall, by telling us that it is a snake. The whole story is, so at the end, a snake, okay, well the mark on the wall is a snake. But the story is long enough. And it has absolutely nothing that's so, no importance, or nothing is revealed at the end by knowing that it's a snake. Right? But this answer to the question simply parodies those conventional realist endings that seem to clear up our confusion and satisfy our curiosity, like detective stories, for example. In detective stories, you're satisfied at the end because you know what happened and you know who did something, etc. Whereas in those stories, you don't have that. And it's a parody of that one, right? They write so that they can break that cycle of writing. Because for them, it perpetuates a type of thinking and a type of analysis of the world and understanding of reality has been based on a realistic view, realistic in the sense, in like basically just conventional way of understanding the world. A simplified version of reality would be like what you see is what you get, right? Whereas in this story, you say, no, it's more complicated than that. Reality is not just this, it's more than that. Is reality what I see? Was reality, is it, for example, a person, I look at a person, is that person who I see just like that, does that say everything about the person? Just his face, his physique, whatever? Or is there more in that person? Who is the real person? Is it the physical appearance that I have in front of me, or the interior reality that person has inside herself or themselves, etc.? Right? And so that if you want to talk about someone in this sense, then you have to know their psychology, you have to know how their feelings, and it's complicated. It's not just the physical appearance of a person that determines who they are. Okay? Usually this is how people believe. I mean, it's like appearances. People are always fooled by appearances. We look at a person, and from appearance, we judge the person saying this is a good person or not. Just basically by looking at the person, and we make judgments about that. But we don't know who the real person is. Huh? And so that's the idea. They want to go beyond this. They want to go beyond this, simplifying reality to appearances. Everything, things are more complex, are more complicated than what we see. But this answer to the question simply parodies those conventional realist endings, the one that we saw with the detective, that seem to clear up our confusion and satisfy our curiosity. It says it's not enough, and it's not the real thing. There is more than that. What if the detective is wrong, for example? Read the story, and it gives you and there is a crime, and the detective does everything, and he finds or she finds that the criminal, only that it's not the one, but he didn't tell you in the novel, on the story. Well, we take it for granted that whatever the detective arrives at, the conclusion of the detective are true. He's a detective, so he must know. And he will convince us with arguments and proof, etc., that the person did something bad. Right? What if he's wrong? And it's not that person. So in that case, the answers that you get at the end of the story are lies. Are fooling. They're illusions. They're misleading. You've been misled. You understand? That's why, that kind of conventional form is problematic too, in this sense, because it's not always true. You can see, for example, the real things that happen in the world. For example, people being accused of something, especially in places where there is so much racism and criminality, and so they relate, for example, crime to a certain category of people, and then the police, in their rush to get answers, they would just find someone who is the perfect criminal, right? The perfect suspect, and would say, oh, he did it. Right? This is the person who did the crime, and they will invent all kinds of things. They will find all kinds of of it. They will even fabricate the proof and the evidence until they convict the person, they send them to jail or sentence them to death, and then only to find out that it's later on somebody finds out that it's not, that it's all rigged, that that person is not the real criminal. And so in that case, whoever was reading that as a story or as a film has been fooled, right? You've been misled completely, and the public is misled because somebody was covering up. So, do you understand what I'm saying? The point I'm making is that that realist, what we call the realist ending or the realist narrative, is conventional. Conventional in the sense that it's just a tradition it's a way of doing things, but it's not the only way. It's a way of writing, it's a way of thinking about the world, it's a way of thinking about reality, but it's not the only one. There are other ways of thinking about it. Because if you allow just that one, then you will be completely wrong. Again, I will give you the same example I gave many times. When there is something that happened outside and you witnessed it, and we only listen to one person, then we get a slanted vision. We get one person. We don't get the other people who invent, like witnesses, who can give a different account of things. And then you end up with having completely different stories, right? Whereas if you just go with one, well, and maybe it satisfies your desire to finish things off quickly, but it does not really bring justice. And it's not fair, and it's not clear, and it's not true, and it's, you understand? And it's not ethical. There's a problem with ethics there, especially when it comes to justice. Right. I gave you the example of this, like those of Sherlock Holmes, for example. Because, Enola Holmes, yes. Well, but Sherlock Holmes is the real one. Okay. There is also movies. Sherlock Holmes is a movie too, right? Because it's a book, right? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, 19th century British writer who wrote Sherlock Holmes. And it's Sherlock Holmes, by the way, is a very interesting kind of narratives, sort of stories that are based on that like highlight logic and science and reason in detective stories, but it's not just. It's a sort of allegory of life in general. The search for truth can only be found by using science and reason and logic. That's what he does. This is how he finds it, not by any other forms. And so it's like very biased in the sense it is, it defends, if you want, science. If we ask what Woolf's story is about, we realize that it is about life, about itself as a story. Right? In other words, it's not about the mark on the wall, but it's about the story itself. Right? There is something similar with that we studied also in some classes. It's called the yellow wallpaper. I don't know if you know about this one. No? The yellow wallpaper? If you're asking for what the yellow wallpaper, then you're asking about the whole story. Because the story, when you read the story, it's not, the yellow wallpaper is only something that reveals to us the depression of the character, right? So but you have to read till the end. And the details are from beginning until the end. That's where you can find that. So also, there is another story called the figure in the carpet. It's a short story by Henry James. The figure in the carpet. You know the carpet, right? And there is a figure inside, but a mystery. And the figure in the carpet is a parable, a sort of an allegory of reading and interpreting. Everyone tries to understand, and it's about actually critics, readers, professional readers who are trying to understand the work of a novelist. And they were asking, and they said, well, we found it. We find the secret. To understand his books, there is a secret. But only to find out that actually it's not. And then the whole thing starts about the impossibility of finding that secret. Because there is no secret. The only secret is to read everything. There is no secret to open things up for you. So you have to read everything and you have to focus on everything. But it's not like a mystery that you have to find. It's not a code that you have to have. But there is no code. The code is that you have to read everything, that's all. And it's about reading the whole thing, not just looking for a final answer to things. Okay. Right. In narrative, there is, we speak about story and discourse. This is discourse in the French word discours, récit, discours in French. Récit, discours. Récit is narrative. Discours is the telling, the way of telling the story. One of the most fundamental distinctions in narrative theory is story and discourse. We make this one. Jonathan Collar, I give lots of examples from him, has suggested the fundamental premise of narratology is that narrative has a double structure. The level of the story, of the told, in other words, there are two levels. What is told, in other words, the content, the events, and the other level is the narration, or the narrative, the telling, the discourse, right? Or discourse. These levels have been given different names by different theorists. Right? By the Russian formalists, for example, they call them fabula. Fabula is the story, what happens, the events. And sujet is the way of telling. The French structures call them récit or histoire and discours, etc. So they have these different ways of talking about these two levels in narrative. But the thing is that it's hard to make really a difference between to separate these two. Those are things that are good for analysis or for discussion, but it's really hard to differentiate between the form and the content, because basically it's just form and content, if you want. The story in this sense involves the events or actions which the narrator would like us to believe occurred, the events, for example, explicitly or implicitly represented. Discourse, on the other hand, involves the way in which these events are recounted or told. They get told, the organization of the telling, etc. Then, in other words, the narration. An equivalent would be form and content, if you want. It's the form and content, the form in which that content is given to us. Form being discourse and telling, etc., whereas the content would be story or the events and content. Of course, these two levels can never be entirely separated, and much narrative theory has been concerned to describe ways in which they interact. So it's not about separating the two. It's not that which matters, narrative, the story and the way and the telling of the story. That the separation does not work. It's not important. What is more important is actually the way in which those two cannot be separated. They become inseparable when the form and the content are the same. If you look at that story I gave you earlier about the content, the story, the mark on the wall. The mark on the wall, and if you look at that, the only way you can understand the story is by reading all of it, and because the form of the story itself is the story. If you're looking only for the story, there is nothing happening. The same thing with the dead. The story, the physical events or something that looks like physical events are just like three things: go to the party, come from the party, go into sleep. That's it. And so if that's what you want to focus on, it's the event. That's the events. That's the thing. But then it's the way this thing and what happens in between the form, in other words, the narrative, in other words, is what matters. Right? And so we cannot separate those two. They are one thing. So many literary works are told in ways that the narrative moves forward and backward in time and shifts from the level of telling to that of the told in complex and unnerving ways. We've already given examples of those. For example, modernist and postmodernist texts experiment with the relation between these two levels to denounce or defamiliarize our sense of how narratives function. In other words, the type of metafiction that we call metafiction is a type of novels. Metafiction exists. There are lots of novels that's called metafiction novels. And those metafiction are novels that tell stories, but they also tell how they're telling the stories. In other words, there is a part where the narrator starts to speak about his characters in ways that you, as a reader or as a critic, speak about them. There is in other words, a discourse on fiction in this. For example, talking about how these are not real characters, that they're just fictitious characters, and that I'm just inventing them to make fun, etc. Inside the story, which breaks the illusion, right? Because when you read the novel, you want to see that as if it's something, it's like a film. You want to see that it's like real. But when there is something like Hitchcock who appears in the scene to break your concentration and nerve you with his talking about his own characters in the film, or how he made the film, right? Or why he chose this angle and not this angle. He said, well, I have chosen to show you the character from this perspective because no, just show me the character. This is what he said. I just want to see the character. But he stops the films to tell you how he showed that. That's metafiction. It's the same thing happens inside fiction, where the narrator or the author himself steps into the book and starts talking about how he chose the characters and how he focused on this and not this. And what was the point in the whole thing, etc. In other words, he's doing the reading for you. I mean, intervening, that. So it's a game, so it's sort of a game, but it's sometimes very interesting because you have to step out from the condition in which you are absorbed in the reading, and then you say, hang on a second, this is fiction. This is all manufactured. It's not the real thing. Okay? It's all about making the reader think, not just absorb things as they're given to him or her, but to actually have some kind of response to things that they are reading or watching. Okay? Robert Coover's short story, The Babysitter, for instance, presents several slightly different accounts of what appears to be the same evening from a number of different perspectives. The contradictions and dislocations produced within and between these accounts, however, make it impossible finally to determine the precise nature or order of the evening's events. Right? This is not about characters they give in different different versions. It's about saying it from this perspective and then from another perspective and from a different perspective. So we have different perspectives in which the same thing is told. Right? And at the end, if you're looking for a final vision of what happened that evening, you will not find it. You will find so many versions of the same thing. And you will be at a loss on which one to choose. Then you have to take all of them, or you have to reject all of them. But it broke the habit, right? It achieved its purpose in breaking your habit of looking for one final vision or one big picture at the end of something. If I were you, I would go, for example, and look for the short story called The Babysitter and read it. Or The Mark on the Wall and read it. Or The Dead by James Joyce. You should be curious and go look for them. They're all online. You can find them and you can read them to understand more about the examples I'm giving you. Everything that we have said until now, all the things have been said, is based on the idea that linearity is fundamental. That the basic thing and the fundamental structure of all narratives is linearity. In other words, whether it's broken or not broken, whether it's continuous or continued, or it is broken up, there is a sense of linearity because we are people, we are humans who live in time. And time is in us. We cannot live outside of time. And our brains and our psyches and everything in us has been determined by this thing that we call time, that it is linear, that we started as little babies and then we grow up and grow, etc., etc. And so there is a linearity in our life as well. I mean, biology explains it, geology explains it, everything, history, everything, biology, geology, whatever you take, has this form of linearity of time. And things are coming in succession. Things happen one after the other. Right? And so this is what we call linearity, and we find it in stories. And this is why we're talking about that. And that's what lots of fiction tries to break, the linearity. There's so many stories that go around to say linearity is a convention too. It's related to how we see time. Right? It's related to the fact that we live in time and that we are determined by time. In addition to this, we might consider another important aspect of the narrative, namely the relation between teller and listener or reader. Right? So if we are only looking at linearity of stories and how things are told, right? And how we reach the event and how we reach the end and how we receive the events in the story or what happens in the story, we can see it from different perspectives as well, and one of them is to focus on the reader. Right? Read it from the perspective of a reader or a listener if you're listening to a story. Barbara Herrnstein Smith argued that we need to ground our understanding of narrative in terms of someone telling someone else that something happened. Someone telling someone else that something happened. So we have to think of that. In other words, when you say someone told somebody about something that happened, then it's the receiver who gets highlighted, telling someone telling someone else about something that happened. So the thing that happened becomes secondary. Not focusing on the events of the story, but focusing on who receives the story, who gets the story at the end, who receives it. The listener, the reader, the watcher, the viewer in a film, etc. These proposition redirects our focus from the events or action themselves to the relationship between the author or teller and the reader or listener. Okay? Again, Jonathan Keller comes to us with something. To tell a story is to claim a certain authority. We're talking about relationship, about author and authority. I've already spoken about this before. The authority of a book. The authorship, right? Authorship, in other words, the fact of being an author of a book or of a text or anything, right? And authority are connected. It gives whoever has his name or her name on a book an authority over us because they are telling us something. Right? They are the ones who hold that. In other words, when we say that they have an authority on whom? Not on themselves, not on the book itself, but on us as readers. Right? And say, this is my book. I have something to tell you. Right? And why do we read it? Because we think that the person has something to say. He's an authority in a certain field. And that person is telling us something because he has a legitimacy of a kind, a certain kind, but conventional mostly. And we have to listen, or we want to listen to them, to what they have to say. Much of the work in narrative theory has involved attempts to discriminate among different kinds of narrators. We have those. It's very important to know this, you know what you already know. First person, third person, objective, subjective, reliable, unreliable, so-called, etc., omniscient or not. Together with questions concerning his or her point of view, his or her voice, and so on. In narrative theory, there is this distinction between the different types of narrators. First person, first person, third person. But also point of view is more important. Point of view or voice of the narrator. Where is the narrator intervening? Is the narrator only telling us what happened, or is he or she intervening in what happened? In other words, directing us. You understand? Not just telling us events or sequences of events, but also ordering them for us. In other words, intervening and exerting an authority through the way of saying things on us as readers, because it directs us and then it commands and it controls the way we think and the way we perceive things, because they come from someone who ordered them for us in a certain way. The events that are told from a point of view, and so the narrators are, most of the time, we should suspect them of trying to influence us as readers with their own view, their own point of view. They're not objective. We think they're objective. If we think they're objective, then we are completely fooled. There is always something of themselves in what they say, even if they're talking about something else. In other words, it's unavoidable. Subjectivity is unavoidable. There is no such a thing as objectivity. Our understanding of a text is pervaded by our sense of the character, trustworthiness, and objectivity of the figure who is narrating. This is what we have to move beyond, because we think that they're objective, that they're authority, that we trust them, that we can, and authors know this. Most postmodernist authors know this, and they exploit it to fool us, in order to make us believe that you should not just follow people, that you shouldn't just think that way is the final or the real way or the only way because it was told by someone in a book, but you have to read it differently. Right? If you have questions, you can just raise your hands and talk, okay? Any questions? Interrupt me anytime. A very important distinction in certain ironic texts, for example. I give you an example that really says something different. That says something in that sense, at least. Jonathan Swift. How many of you know Jonathan Swift? Jonathan Swift is an Irish novelist. a storyteller. You know, probably Gulliver's Travels? No? Wow. He wrote an essay called A Modest Proposal in 1729. He's Irish, I told you that, right? And it provides one of these examples of narratorial irony, where you have to be very attentive and very careful when you read it. In his essay, the narrator proposes that in order to deal with poverty and hunger in Ireland, and to prevent children of the poor from being a burden to their parents, such children should be sold to the rich as food. He says there are so many children in Ireland that they're hungry, and there is a big problem of famine in Ireland. Why don't we just take all the children and give them to the English people, the rich English people, so that they can eat them as food? Sell them, and the money would help, to alleviate the famine and poverty in Ireland. He says that the Irish have so many children. Why don't they just give their children as food to the rich? Eat them, he says. That would be a solution that would be innocent, cheap, easy, and effectual. It's an easy solution, he said. He calls it a modest proposal to end famine in Ireland. The narrator appears to make his proposal seriously, but we necessarily conceive of an implied author. Says, is he serious? When you read that, say, no, it can't be serious. No one can do that. Right? And so you're thinking, why? Wait. So the narrator is not serious, but the author has a different view, has a completely different vision, different perspective on things. He is not, of course, saying this. Jonathan Swift is not saying that. It's a narrator who's saying that. It's another persona, if you want, of the narrator, of the author, who's saying that in irony. Right? Using irony to give this proposal. But Jonathan Swift is absolutely against this idea. It's completely crazy to think that Jonathan Swift would defend the idea of having children eaten by the English rich people. Okay? And so we conceive of an implied author who has very different views and motives and who is making a political point. And actually, he's making a point politically, right? About poverty and the state of poverty and what caused it in Ireland, who was under the control and the power and the ruling of the British Empire. It says, if they are poor, it's because someone else is rich. Someone rich make themselves rich and at the expense of these poor people. That's the point that he was trying to make. The Irish are poor, were poor then, now they're not poor anymore. But they're poor because British were taking everything from them. The English were taking everything. Right? The morality of the English government and its attitude towards poverty in Ireland, and how the English government doesn't care about the people in Ireland. They're only interested in what they can take from them, not what they can give them. Our understanding of the ironic force of the text necessitates a discrimination between the two voices of personae of the narrator and the implied author. We have two things. We have to distinguish between the two. When he says that, he's making a statement. But it's not him who's doing it. The narrator is saying something, the author makes him say that to make a different point, to make a political point about that. Another way of looking at that, with always this idea of focusing on the listener, the reader, the viewer, etc., is to think about the power, question of power again. Remember, we already talked about power before, and this is like another recasting of the same theme in a different, a different school of theory, which is narratology. We take the example of Shahrazad. You all know Shahrazad. You can't tell me you don't know her, at least. Right? to 1001 Nights, Alfi Lawlila. And you know the story of Shahrazad, right? She's taken by the king Shahryar and she tells him stories. Shahryar was this crazy person, this crazy man who spends the night with every night with a different woman, and in the morning he kills her. Right? But Shahrazad came and then she found a way of controlling him. She tells him a story and she never ends it. And he can't kill her because he wants the end of the story. But she keeps going and going and going and going. The same story in order to stop him from killing her. It's a very effective way of avoiding that. So she staves off, in other words, she delays her execution by telling him stories. And by ending her story each night, at a particularly exciting point, she is able to delay her death for another day because the king wants to find out what happened next, only to start another branch of that same story, which goes again to a very complicated point where it says, okay, well, we have to finish this tomorrow. And then it goes on, and 1001 Nights. This is the point about this story. Okay? Now, what makes it intriguing from a narrative theorist, for a narrative theorist, has to do with this enactment of forms of power, because she has a power. This is where the narrator has a power over the reader, the listener. She controls him. She can give him what she wants and withhold from him what she wants. And so he is like subjected to her. The irony is that he is a king, he's powerful, he has the power, right? And he can do whatever he wants. But here, she found the weak point, she found where she can actually get to him. And that's by exploiting his love of stories. Right? And so she has what we call a narrative power, a sort of an oppositional stance, a practice of resistance. This is how she resists the power. She's weak, but that gives her power. Telling stories gives her the power to control her destiny, to control the king. In exploiting the narrative situation, discovers the power not to change the essential structure of narrative, but to change its other, in other words, the narrator, the one who listens, through the achievement and maintenance of authority in ways that are potentially radical. And this is what change says. Okay? So, probably so she is exerting narrative power over political power, right? Narrative power does not only come from, this is an example of when the powerless become powerful through the use of storytelling, through the use of language, right? Because the powerful also sometimes, for example, in politics, when you take, for example, a government that rules over people by convincing them that what they do is good for them, telling them the story of what is good for them, and convincing the people that they are right, that they should follow them, and whatever they do is for the benefit of the people, and so the people will be under that influence and they will be following without reacting, without rebelling, without saying no, without resisting. They would just follow, and the government will be happy because it has both political power and narrative power. In other words, they have an ideology, right? That convinces the people that it's right, that it's the truth, that's the only thing that matters. And so in that case, it's also narrative power that gives political power too, as well. But the king in Shahrazad has political power, but he doesn't have narrative power because he has nothing to say. He was a brute, he was a beast. right? And the one who's smart, who's intelligent, is actually the woman who had the narrative power. And so it turned out that the narrative power is more important than the physical or the political power. Right? That's something that modern leaders and modern governments know now. They know that political power on its own is useless. You have to have narrative power. You have to have a narrative power, which is an ideology, that convinces people that it is right, or that works in ways that people want to stay under that, to follow that, the sound, the noise from outside. Sorry, that's distracting. Okay? All right. I think we have to take a moment. Do you have any questions about this? Nice. There is a lot more, to say about narrative, but that's enough.